All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most absolutely fascinating and honestly urgent mysteries in all of human history. Why are some nations incredibly wealthy while others seem completely trapped in cycles of poverty? This isn't just some abstract economic puzzle. It's a daily reality that dictates life expectancy, educational opportunities, and basically the fundamental boundaries of human potential for billions of people all over the world. And the answer to this massive divide? Well, it's actually not what most people think, and it's going to completely shift how we view the world.
We're going to start with a really stark, real-world contrast. Picture this: a single city cut entirely in half by a physical fence. If you're standing by this fence and look north to Nogales, Arizona, you're going to see paved roads, functioning public schools, and a community where the average household income sits right around $30,000 a year. Residents there have access to Medicare, reliable electricity, and relatively safe streets. But if you just turn around, literally look just a few feet south to Nogales, Sonora in Mexico, daily life is radically altered. You find an average income that's a mere fraction of the North. You see a struggling public health infrastructure, way higher infant mortality, and the constant everyday risk of crime and cartel violence.
So you have to ask yourself a crucial question here. How on earth could two halves of what is basically the exact same city be so fundamentally different? Because, think about it, it's definitely not about geography or the climate or the disease environments. It's not even about culture. The residents of both halves share the exact same ancestors, they listen to the same music, they eat the same food. The real secret to this drastic divergence, it lies entirely in that invisible border and the man-made political and economic institutions that border represents.
Section 1. The Spanish Blueprint: Extraction and Exploitation.
To figure out how these entirely different institutions formed, we have to rewind a bit. Let's look at the early colonial strategies of the 1500s. When Spanish conquistadors, guys like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, arrived in the Americas, their strategy was pure shock and awe. They'd just march right in, capture the indigenous leader, loot all the accumulated gold, and then instantly implement something called the encomienda system. Now, this was not just a simple grant of land. It was a horrifying grant of human beings. It forced massive local populations to surrender all their agricultural surplus and perform brutal physical labor for a newly installed Spanish elite. They were coercing labor and extracting tribute at a completely unprecedented scale.
To really grasp the sheer human cost of this whole setup, just listen to Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a Dominican priest who actually participated in the early conquests, but then became deeply horrified by what he was witnessing. He documented the utter cruelty of the Spanish blueprint. He described how settlers would treat the entire native population basically as property, making them labor night and day in their own interests without any rest whatsoever. This first-hand account brings an incredibly heavy, emotional weight to what economists usually just clinically refer to as an extractive economic system.
Fast forward a bit, and the Spanish hit what was essentially the ultimate jackpot, the massive Silver Mountain of Potosi. This single mountain basically became the economic engine of the entire Spanish Empire. It funded their wars and royal extravagance all across Europe. But extracting that silver, it required an unimaginable amount of labor. So Viceroy Francisco de Toledo actually revived and adapted an old Inca institution called the mita. He mandated that 1/7 of the male population across a huge geographic region had to pack up their lives and march hundreds of miles just to work in these treacherous, incredibly toxic mines. It very quickly became the largest, most onerous scheme of labor exploitation in the entire colonial era.
And this is where it gets crazy. That historical boundary of the forced labor catchment area perfectly overlaps with the old Inca Empire's most densely populated regions. It's a brilliant illustration of path-dependent change. Because even today, centuries later, if you visit the province of Acemoglu, which was trapped inside this historical mita boundary, the modern reality is grim. You'll find unpaved roads, fewer schools, and significantly less economic opportunity than the nearby province of Cauca, which sat just slightly outside that boundary. It's like history left a permanent geographic scar on regional prosperity.
Section 2. The Jamestown Struggle: An Accidental Democracy.
Meanwhile, up in North America, the English arrived totally late to the colonial game. The elites running the Virginia Company, they wanted nothing more than to just copy the exact same Spanish extraction model right in Jamestown. They fully expected to capture a local chief, siphon off the wealth, and force the indigenous population to farm for them. But geography completely thwarted their business plan. Back in 1500, North America had an incredibly low population density compared to Mexico or Peru. There were no vast indigenous empires to conquer, no accumulated gold to loot, and, most importantly, no massive, sedentary populations to coerce into doing their work.
So, faced with starvation and an indigenous population that could just easily slip away, the Virginia Company pivoted to exploiting their own English settlers.
They instituted the draconian laws divine, moral, and martial. Guys, the Virginia Company basically implemented the worst corporate HR policy in human history. The punishment for almost everything, running away, stealing a few ears of corn, or selling goods, was literally the death penalty. But with an incredibly vast and open frontier sitting right there just a few miles away, the settlers simply ran off to join the indigenous tribes, or they completely refused to work. They had options. Pure coercion was totally failing. In this desperate situation, it led to what we call the pivot of 1618. Because the elites couldn't coerce the locals, and they completely failed to coerce their own settlers, they were forced by circumstance to completely change the rules if they wanted the colony to survive at all. They started offering 50 acres of land to each settler, guaranteeing private property rights, and they actually introduced a general assembly to give the settlers a political voice. It's a really profound realization. Inclusive economic incentives and democratic political rights in the U.S., they weren't born out of lofty ideals or benevolence. They were an accidental byproduct of elites having absolutely no other choice.
Section 3. The divergence of opportunity.
So how exactly did these radically different historical blueprints, ruthless extraction in the South and this sort of accidental inclusion in the North, shape modern innovation? Well, we can see a really stark divergence when comparing the paths to enormous wealth. Take Thomas Edison in the US. The guy had very little formal schooling, yet he was able to file over 1,000 patents, start a bunch of new firms, and fund his wild ideas by securing loans from a highly open, competitive banking sector. Contrast that with Mexican telecom billionaire Carlos Slim, or historical elites like Porfirio Diaz. Their colossal wealth relied not on grassroots innovation, but heavily on state monopolies, political favors, and closed banking systems specifically designed to crush competition and protect insiders.
A really prime example of how this plays out legally is the recurso de amparo, which translates to an appeal for protection. Now, while it was originally meant to protect individual rights, Carlos Slim brilliantly manipulated tools like the amparo to intentionally delay anti-monopoly rulings for years. This wasn't just some clever legal trick. It had massive real-world consequences. It cost everyday Mexican citizens billions of dollars in massively inflated telecom prices just to fund Slim's monopoly power. It absolutely proves that in extractive economies, high entry barriers and political connections completely dictate who gets to succeed, totally stifling sheer talent or innovation.
Section 4. The geography hypothesis fails.
Now, right about now, you might be asking yourself, wait, what about the climate? Couldn't this all just be about geography? Thinkers like the French philosopher Montesquieu famously proposed that hot, tropical climates naturally make nations lazy, uninnovative, and poor. And I'll be honest, when you glance at a modern map of global prosperity, this geography hypothesis definitely has a strong superficial appeal. It almost sounds like common sense. The darkest areas on the map, representing deep poverty, certainly seem heavily concentrated right along the tropics, in Africa, Central America, and South Asia.
But here's the thing. Recorded history completely thoroughly debunks this myth through a phenomenon called the reversal of fortune. See, 500 years ago, before European colonization, tropical regions held incredibly wealthy and complex civilizations. The Aztecs built these magnificent cities with floating gardens and towering pyramids. The Incas engineered vast mountain empires. Meanwhile, temperate regions like the US, Canada, and Australia were historically much sparsely populated and economically poorer. And as for the burden of tropical diseases like malaria, that is largely a tragic symptom of poverty and a lack of public health infrastructure, not the root cause of the poverty itself. So geography ultimately is not our economic destiny.
Section 5. Institutions shape our destiny.
So if it isn't geography, what actually drives global inequality? Well, it comes down to man-made political and economic institutions. And the people living under these extractive systems, they understand this intimately. During the Arab Spring, protesters didn't take to the streets demanding a different climate, right? Listen to the words of Noha Hamid in Egypt's Tahrir Square. She pointed directly to corruption, oppression, and a deliberately broken system. The citizens of these nations know exactly who is keeping them poor. Their poverty is directly caused by a narrow elite monopolizing political power just to feather their own nests at the expense of the vast mass of people.
As we reflect on the global landscape today, we aren't just analyzing ancient history, right? We are confronting the present. These historical blueprints of extraction and inclusion, they continue to shape the trajectory of nations right now. The choice of institutions is ultimately a human one. So the next time you look at the global economy, I want you to ask yourself, are we building systems that empower the many with inclusive incentives and true opportunity, or are we quietly tolerating institutions that just extract wealth to protect a powerful few? The answer to that question, that is what truly determines the future of our prosperity.